Tonight I'm going to start with a very ordinary experience that I had a couple of weeks ago. It's the kind of experience we all have on a regular basis, and that is I received a text message. I'd like to read this one to you. She was released with her buddy in October near Riggins, Idaho. They are with a yearling buck that is showing them the ropes. I got this text message and I felt an extraordinary amount of happiness, a disproportionate amount of happiness. I immediately forwarded it to both of my daughters, and they texted me back feeling an extraordinary amount of happiness. I texted it to a couple of friends, and I was told I'm going to meet this animal in heaven someday. And all of this happiness was going on, and you would wonder why. I think one of the reasons why this text made me so happy is that it articulates a really positive outcome in relation to something I had invested in. You wouldn't understand that until I tell you the story. Last summer, I encountered a 2-day-old fawn. My neighbor's son had found this orphaned fawn in the middle of a busy country road. Cars were trying to avoid it, and it was clearly panic-stricken. As he slowed his vehicle down, it plunged into an irrigation ditch and got caught in the current and was struggling to make it. So he pulled over, caught the fawn, brought it home, wasn't sure what to do with it. They were just on their way out of town. They'd been waiting for him. They had to leave, and it was at the end of a working day. So I said, hand me the fawn. I'll figure something out. So into my arms got placed this 2-day-old animal, and it was a moving experience that I'd put my hand on my heart, but it was overdramatic. It was a striking kind of experience, and I realized all of a sudden that this was a really vulnerable animal. I also realized it was a privilege, and I also realized that we're very interdependent, that if I didn't do something, it might not make it. And it got me thinking about this kind of thing. 2 days later, despite the advice of some who said, this is just nature's way, you just have to deal with it. Others said, just go put it back close to where you found it and let things take its course. I had the kind of feeling that I bet we've all had, and I want to think about this feeling a little bit tonight. It was a very quiet but very definite feeling that I need to do my best here. I just need to do my best. It was quiet, it's easy to reason away from it, but somehow it really mattered. So 2 days later, this little fawn was in an animal crate on its way to Boise with my colleague Karen Esplin, who was driving over to Boise anyway. We had worked together, and I had found an animal rescue nonprofit organization, and so we were really hopeful. It had been 2 days without its mom, and despite the fact that I had tried my best, I didn't have the skills, and I knew that it was undernourished and underhydrated. It hadn't had proper bowel movements for a couple of days, and it was showing some significant signs of distress. I was very relieved when I got this photograph from Karen as she handed the fawn into the arms of Dr. Scott, who devotes so much time and attention restoring the health to animals, orphaned deer in particular. And it happened that she was raising another fawn, and she gave it the proper care necessary. And it was her text that I received that told me that she had been released into the wild, back into her natural habitat. And I think the joy I felt was this little deer gets a shot. It gets a shot. I'm left still wondering, though, why so happy? What is it about that would make me so happy when I have a lot of things that happen in a day? I think it was that it made me feel awake. I'm interested in what it takes to feel awake. For a little while there, I just saw the magic in the world. I saw the magic in all the living things around me. I saw the magic in the trees. I saw the connection between beings. And I just, for a little while, I felt really awake. And I kind of want to think about that tonight. There's a line that I want to use as kind of a guiding principle of my discussion here tonight. It's from a poem. William Stafford's a favorite poet of mine. He has a poem called A Ritual to Read to Each Other. And in that poem, he makes an assertion. He says, for it is important that awake people be awake. I've thought about that line for a long time. What does it mean to be awake, and why is it important? And one of the things that's occurred to me, it's really important that we're awake to each other. But tonight we were asked to talk about excellence. And you might be wondering, what does being awake and excellence, what do they have to do with each other? So let's just get really simple for a moment. I want to talk about lines and circles. Most of the time when we think about excellence, we're thinking about a line, upward mobility, a climb, the ladder of success. We're thinking about an accumulation of measurable accomplishments, something that we can quantify, something that we can show to be an achievement, something that we can see and hold and touch, see it, visible, tangible. But what if success could also be a circle? What if instead of climbing, it was harmonizing? What if It was taking the inner values that we hold most dear, the feelings that we read most deeply, and translating those into the commitments that we engage in and the activities that we perform in our external lives. What if it were bringing the parts together? So tonight, I'm going to go with the proposition that it's important that awake people be awake. And in relation to that, that being harmonized in our inner values with our external commitments is part of that being awake. And to explore that, there are three possibilities that I think it raises, this idea of being awake, and I find them to be hopeful. Okay, so the first possibility I want to talk about is this. What if it's possible that just because something is quiet doesn't mean it can't be heard? What if I can hear things that are quiet? Now, to explore this idea, I'm going to use two experiences. I've been very fortunate. I had an experience for several years on the Native American reservation, the Fort Hall Indian Reservation down the road. A nonprofit organization paid me to be there to work with those kids. So I'm going to use that as one of the examples to illustrate these possibilities. And the other example is a few years ago I had the opportunity, not for nearly as long, but I spent a brief amount of time in Nigeria. And in both of those cases, I became very aware of these possibilities that I want to talk about. And one is that just because something's quiet doesn't mean it can't be heard. Just like it was quiet for me when I knew I had to take action in relation to the fawn, so I've had that experience time and again, and some of the kids I worked with on the reservation felt this way as well. So let's start with Fort Hall. When I was asked to work on the Fort Hall reservation, at that time, unemployment was about 50%. This was pre-casino era. But they were struggling with 50% unemployment. I'd like you to consider for a moment, if you would, the kinds of social problems that associate when we get up to like 9% unemployment or 10% unemployment. But what if half the people around you were unemployed? Half of the adults were unemployed. And so the kids coming into the schools there, everyone anticipated that they would manifest signs of being at risk. A lot of them came with underachievement academically. A lot of them came with definite signs of extreme poverty, with substance abuse-related issues, with anger management manifestations. They came with a lot of struggles, and the leaders of the reservation, the tribe, wanted to help their kids, and so they paid these nonprofit organizations to come in and try and engage it, and I did writing with these kids. So this is the first day of a writing camp that I was involved in, and they would let us use the wrestling room. And there are a couple of things that I want to point out. It was really hard to get these kids to write, because they're part of an oral tradition. They gain their knowledge by stories, and they pass the stories on from generation to generation. They don't write them down. So when a white person comes into the reservation and says, hey, I want you to write your stories down, they're not very responsive. And you can kind of tell here they're a little bit standoffish, and they're a little bit aloof, and they're guarded right at first. But what I want you to notice most are these walls. They're empty. Okay, so we were in this room every day, and this was the first day, and these walls started out empty. But I found something. These are quiet kids when it comes to talking to me. They're reticent. They're hesitant to engage it. But when you start to listen, even though it's quiet, you can hear them. They want to be heard as soon as they trust that you're actually listening. So these kids start to notice things, and you form a bond, and you can start to connect with these children. Okay, and they're kind of quiet, and they talk to each other, and then every now and then they'll share something with you. And they start to want to write things down. And I got to thinking a lot when I was working with these kids on the reservation that just because something's quiet doesn't mean it can't be heard. So I'm going to put a pause on the reservation for just a moment and shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about my experience in Africa for a moment. When I was first asked to go to Nigeria, it had been a lifelong dream of mine to go to Africa, and it was supposed to just be a regular professional visit. I had met a gentleman named Lade Adiemi, and he had invited me to go do persuasion trainings in a very traditional kind of setting, and I was maybe going to see a little bit about the culture and the countryside while I was there. I was a little nervous about going. I wasn't going with the BYU-I team or anybody else. I just was getting on a plane and going to Nigeria. And so I read on the State Department website, it's a country of warning. You shouldn't really travel there unless you have a good reason. Kidnappings are common and so forth. So I was a little bit nervous about going, but I really wanted to go. And so I felt sure that I could trust him and it was going to be okay. Through a variety of events, I wound up spending the majority of my time, rather than in the kind of classroom setting, in a small village along the Ogun River called Otun Araromi. While I was there, I had this distinct feeling repeatedly while I was there that there was something that I needed to hear, something that I needed to listen to. I'm still not quite sure what it is. Fort Hall is kind of in the past. I have a better handle on it. But the funny thing about being awake is you don't always know exactly how to take the things that you're responsive to. So I went into this village. Now, depending on which survey you read, the lifespan in Nigeria is remarkably low. It ranges anywhere from the high 40s to the low 50s. But regardless of the study, they're lagging about 20 years behind the average lifespan worldwide. If you ran a worldwide average, Nigerians are apt to live 20 years less. And all of the surveys point to two significant causes for this shortened lifespan. Extreme poverty, which unfortunately is growing rather than declining in Nigeria, and pollution. So this is the Ogun River, and Otun-Araromi is a little strip village along the banks of this river. You can see from the look of the river, it's not some pristine, desirable kind of river that you'd want to just run and jump into, probably. Okay. On the bank here, it's not in the photo, but there's a cinder block bathroom with 2 5-gallon buckets. When those buckets are full, they dump them into the river and then return them to the bathroom, which is a cinder block structure. But this is also the river that they wash their clothes in, that they bathe in, and it's also the river that feeds their wells. Okay, so it's the river from which they draw their water. And I just walked through this village, and I'm not even going to claim that I know what to make of it, but I was very observant. I started to see things that were striking. Immediately, I started to see a number of beautiful children. But I was really moved by these children. I was connected to the people. I enjoyed being there. I watched the workers. I watched them work hard. And I felt like there's something here that I'm not getting, but I'm supposed to hear it. There's something I want to hear here. There's something quiet, and I bet it could be heard, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. This is the well from which they draw their water. So the river feeds this particular well, and she was just drawing water for her family's use on this day. Okay, so it's a very different kind of environment. Which leads me to my second possibility. In the face of all of that, and I'm just one person who went there, I think, what can possibly be done? What do you do about something like that? But is it possible, as my second premise here is, maybe just because something's little doesn't mean it can't be big. It kind of goes back to that circle idea. Unlike the ladder where everything is quantitative and can be measured and data-driven, sometimes with the circle, sometimes with harmonizing as the goal, it's the qualitative effect. It's not what I can see, but it's what I can feel. It's what I can sense. It's what I can intuit that helps me keep going and helps me stay awake and reminds me of the importance of that. Maybe just because it's little doesn't mean it can't be big. Okay, so let's go back to Fort Hall for just a minute. Okay, we know we started with these kids that were a little bit aloof, a little bit too cool to do the writing thing. Like, why do we need to go into the wrestling room and do this writing with this woman who's here? But it's kind of interesting what happens when you're listening to people, because what starts really small starts to grow. All of a sudden, they kind of like you, and they kind of like that you're listening to them. They sort of want to hang out and tell you their stories, and you'll notice on the wall behind us, it's starting to fill up. They're starting to come into the wrestling room every day, and they're starting to write things down. Okay, and they started to take a lot of pride in their word wall. They're not word people, they're not normally oriented that way. But all of a sudden, they're finding this thing in themselves, and they love it. And it picks up, and people start to come. And so they take some pride in showing their stories and doing their artwork, and pretty soon the whole wall's full. In fact, you can see the beam there. It got so full that particular summer that we had to start hanging poems from the beams. We were hanging poems and pictures from the rafters and the beams because once they started to express it, they loved it so much. Okay? Just because it's little doesn't mean it can't be big. Now, in the village, it's hard for me to say. I don't know what happened, but I do know that relationships started to form, a lot of relationships. So people started to connect, and they started to be kind to me. They started to accept me and share with me their stories and their faith and their resilience and the human spirit that they had that I thought was beautiful. Okay, this is the chief of the village. They're letting me hold their child. The parents are really, really shy of the camera. They're sitting behind there feeling very embarrassed. You can't really see them very well in the picture. But what a privilege to hold that little baby and to talk to the chief of the village. And he said something to me right then that I haven't forgotten. I listened and I heard it. I don't know what to do about it. But he said, we need your help. What did they need my help with? They need clean water. I heard it. I think it could be big. Right now, I'm doing nothing about it. It's something that's very much on my mind, but I don't want to go to sleep. I want to be awake to it. It seems important that awake people be awake. Which leads to my third possibility. I'd like to propose that maybe just because it can't be seen doesn't mean it isn't there. The fact that I can't see it doesn't mean that nothing's going on. Okay? We'll return to Fort Hall for just a moment. Now, I don't know how Annalisa feels, if it helped her to write about the powwow and her grandmother taking her to the powwow and getting the real hair dye to participate in the dance. But I have to believe that claiming her identity to some point, knowing who she is and standing by it, gives her a strength that will help her face something somewhere down the road with more courage than she might have otherwise. I don't know what Angel Racehorse feels about having tried to manifest who she perceives herself to be in this particular picture, but I know she's going to be up against some tough odds, and I'm certainly hopeful that she's as fierce when she faces them as she was when she was drawing this, because she had some attitude, and I think she's going to need it. I won't be around to see it. It's funny how these things work. They're not about you. They're just kind of like the fawn. They're just sort of about giving somebody a shot. And just because I can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. Do these women remember me? I remember the privilege it felt like when they let me hold this little child, and they treated me as if I was family. When they let me sit on the porch and enjoy some of their family time and their hospitality and their courage, I know it changed me. I have to believe that on some level, at least there was a recognition that people from very different cultures can come together and find common ground. That one person caring about another person presents a power that is real, that it lasts, that there's hope, that there's a mutuality that far exceeds any of the differences that we have. I'll never see it, but I have to believe it's there. So we're left again with the idea of awake people being awake. I believe if we listen to the quiet things, if we trust that something that looks little might be more than it seems, if we believe in what we can't see and the goodness that lies beyond what we can grasp rationally, that we stay more awake. So what's the goal? I think Mary Oliver articulates the goal far better than I ever could. I'll close with her words. Mostly I want to be kind. And nobody, of course, is kind or mean for a simple reason. And nobody gets out of it having to swim through the fires to stay in this world. Thank you very much.